The gunshot echoed across the dusty street of Great Bend, Kansas, freezing Abigail Vance in her tracks as she felt the white-hot pain tear through her shoulder. Time slowed as she collapsed to the ground, her body shielding young Tommy Wilson from the barrage of bullets that had been meant for him. Through the haze of agony, she caught sight of Mason Calloway, his eyes widening in horror before hardening with a fury she'd never witnessed in the usually gentle Cowboy. It was the spring of 1876, and Great Bend was supposed to be Abigail's fresh start. At 24, she traveled from Boston with dreams of opening a proper schoolhouse in this growing railroad town. 6 months into her endeavor, she'd grown to love the community, especially the quiet, reserved rancher who brought his nephew to her lessons 3 times a week. Mason holstered his gun and rushed to Abigail's side, pressing his bandana against the wound as Tommy sobbed beside them. "Get Doc Sullivan," Mason barked at a bystander before turning his attention to Abigail. "Stay with me, Abby," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You're going to be fine." Her vision blurred as she looked up at his weathered face. "Tommy," she managed to ask. "Safe because of you," Mason replied, glancing at his nephew who was trembling but unharmed. "That bullet was meant for him." Abigail tried to nod, but darkness crept around the edges of her consciousness. The last thing she remembered before succumbing to it was Mason's calloused hand cradling her face and his promise, "I'll make this right." When she awoke, Abigail found herself in an unfamiliar bed, the scent of medicine and clean linens surrounding her. Sunlight streamed through partially drawn curtains, casting golden stripes across a simple room. Her shoulder throbbed beneath thick bandages, and even the slightest movement sent waves of pain through her body. "You're awake," a voice said softly. Turning her head, Abigail saw Mrs. Sullivan, the doctor's wife, sitting nearby with needlework in her lap. "How long have I been here?" Abigail asked, her throat dry and voice raspy. "Just over a day," Mrs. Sullivan replied, setting aside her sewing and approaching with a glass of water. "You lost a fair amount of blood, but the bullet went clean through. My husband says you were fortunate an inch to the left and things might have been much different." After helping Abigail take a few sips, Mrs. Sullivan adjusted her pillows. "That poor little boy hasn't stopped asking about you. His uncle's been beside himself too." "Mason and Tommy," Abigail murmured. "Are they all right?" Mrs. Sullivan's expression tightened. "Tommy's shaken but unharmed, thanks to your bravery. As for Mr. Calloway," she hesitated. "He's been hunting Frank Desmond since you were shot. Sheriff Haynes is concerned, says Mason's got vengeance in his eyes." Abigail's heart raced. Frank Desmond was a notorious troublemaker who'd threatened Mason over a boundary dispute involving their neighboring properties. But to shoot at a child. And now Mason was tracking him down alone. "I need to speak with the sheriff," Abigail said, attempting to rise despite the searing pain. "You'll do no such thing," Mrs. Sullivan insisted, gently pushing her back against the pillows. "You need rest. The men will handle Frank Desmond." "But Mason could be hurt or worse," Abigail protested. "Frank isn't alone, he runs with that gang from Dodge City." "Sheriff knows that too," Mrs. Sullivan said soothingly. "Now rest. I'll send word that you're awake." Reluctantly, Abigail settled back, but sleep eluded her as her mind filled with images of Mason confronting Desmond and his gang. She'd grown fond of the quiet rancher over the months since she'd arrived in Great Bend. More than fond, if she was being honest with herself. Their conversations during his visits to collect Tommy from school had become the highlight of her days. Mason was different from the other men in town, educated despite his rugged appearance, thoughtful in his words, and gentle in his manner. He'd lost his brother and sister-in-law to cholera 2 years prior and had been raising Tommy ever since. The responsibility had etched lines of worry around his eyes, but never diminished the kindness within them. And now he was hunting a dangerous man because of her. The day passed slowly, with Doc Sullivan checking her wound and pronouncing her recovery promising but cautioning against movement. Tommy was permitted a brief visit, the boy's eyes red-rimmed as he clutched a crudely drawn get-well card. "Miss Vance," he said solemnly. "Uncle Mason says you saved my life." Abigail managed a smile. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." Tommy shook his head. "Uncle Mason says you're the bravest person in Kansas. He made me promise to look after you while he's gone." "And where has your uncle gone?" Abigail asked carefully. Tommy's gaze dropped to the floor. "He said he had to make sure bad men face justice, Mrs. Peterson is staying with me at the ranch until he returns." After Tommy left, Abigail stared at the ceiling, counting the hours. By nightfall, there was still no word of Mason. The doctor gave her a sleeping draught, but she only pretended to drink it, pouring it into a potted plant when the Sullivans weren't looking. Near midnight, she heard commotion outside, horses approaching, men's voices raised in alarm. With considerable effort, Abigail dragged herself from bed, clutching the bedpost as dizziness threatened to overwhelm her. She managed to reach the window in time to see Sheriff Haynes and 2 deputies escorting 3 bound men down the street toward the jail. Frank Desmond was among them, his face bloodied and sullen, but there was no sign of Mason. Fear gripped Abigail's heart. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and made her way painfully down the stairs, ignoring the protests of her body. She had nearly reached the front door when it swung open, revealing Mason Calloway. He stood motionless in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the night. His duster was covered in dust, his face streaked with dirt and what looked like dried blood. His right hand was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, but he was alive. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. "You should be in bed," he said finally, his voice rough with exhaustion. "And you should have waited for the sheriff," she countered. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I reckon we're both poor at following advice." Mason stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He seemed suddenly uncertain, removing his hat and turning it in his hands. "I wanted to see for myself that you were all right." "I'm healing," Abigail said softly. "Though I'm not supposed to be standing." As if on cue, her legs weakened beneath her. Mason moved quickly, catching her before she fell. The contact sent a different kind of pain through her awareness of his nearness, his strength, the scent of leather and prairie wind that clung to him. "Let me help you back upstairs," he offered. "Tell me what happened first," she insisted. Mason sighed, helping her to a chair in the Sullivans' parlor. He remained standing, seemingly unable to rest. "Desmond and his boys were headed for the territorial border," he explained. "I caught up to them near Pawnee Rock. They didn't expect anyone to follow so quickly." "You confronted 3 armed men alone?" Abigail asked, aghast. 4, Mason corrected. "1 got away, but Sheriff Haynes and his deputies weren't far behind me. They'd been tracking the same trail." "That was reckless," Abigail said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You could have been killed." "They shot you," Mason replied simply, as if that explained everything. "And they meant to kill Tommy, my nephew, a 9-year-old boy." His hands clenched at his sides. "Desmond claimed he was aiming for me, said Tommy was just in the way. But that doesn't change what happened. You stepped in front of those bullets, Abigail, for a child you barely know." "I'm his teacher," she said. "It was instinct." "It was bravery," Mason countered. "And I couldn't let the man who hurt you walk free. I couldn't." The intensity in his voice made her breath catch. There was something unspoken in his words, something that stirred a warmth in her chest despite her pain. "Is Desmond?" she began, unable to finish the question. "Alive," Mason assured her. "Though not for lack of temptation. Sheriff has him locked up, awaiting the circuit judge. He'll hang for attempted murder." Relief washed over her, not for Desmond's fate, which seemed just, but because Mason hadn't become a killer in her name. "And your hand?" she asked, nodding toward his bandaged palm. "Cut it breaking his jaw," Mason admitted, looking somewhat abashed. "Doc can look at it tomorrow. It's nothing compared to what you suffered." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Sullivan's shocked exclamation from the stairway. "Miss Vance. You should be in bed this instant." Despite Abigail's protests, she was swiftly returned to her room, with Mrs. Sullivan scolding her the entire way. Mason promised to return the following day before departing, leaving Abigail to drift into a more peaceful sleep than she'd expected. Over the next 2 weeks, Mason visited daily, often bringing Tommy and always arriving with small gifts, wildflowers from the prairie, a new book from the general store, fresh baked goods from the German bakery on Front Street. He would sit beside her bed, sometimes reading aloud, other times just talking about his day at the ranch. As her strength returned, Abigail began to wonder if his attention stemmed from gratitude or something more. She found herself watching the clock on days he was due to visit, her heart quickening at the sound of his boots on the staircase. When Doc Sullivan finally declared her well enough to leave his care, Abigail faced a dilemma. Her small room above the schoolhouse seemed impossibly far away in her weakened state, and the thought of being alone during her continued recovery was daunting. "You'll stay with us," announced Mrs. Peterson, Tommy's caretaker, during school hours. "I've already spoken with Mr. Calloway. He's had the men prepare the guest room at the ranch house." "I couldn't impose," Abigail protested, though the idea of being close to Mason and Tommy was far from unwelcome. "It's not an imposition," came Mason's voice from the doorway. He stood with his hat in his hands, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. "It's the least I can do after what you did for Tommy, unless you'd prefer other arrangements." Something in his expression, hope mingled with uncertainty, made her decision easy. "I would be grateful for your hospitality," she replied. The Calloway Ranch sat 5 miles outside town, a sprawling property with rolling pastures and a sturdy 2-story house built of local limestone. Mason had inherited it from his parents and expanded it with his brother before the latter's untimely death. Abigail was installed in a comfortable room overlooking a small garden, where Mrs. Peterson fussed over her like a mother hen. Tommy appointed himself her personal assistant, bringing her books and keeping her company with endless chatter about ranch life. Mason, however, seemed suddenly distant. He was unfailingly polite and concerned about her comfort, but the easy conversations they'd shared during her convalescence at the doctor's house had disappeared. He spent long hours working with his men, returning only for meals, during which he spoke little. A week into her stay, Abigail found herself sitting on the covered porch, watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to Mason, returning from checking the herd. He dismounted with the fluid grace that came from a lifetime in the saddle, removing his hat to wipe his brow. When he spotted her on the porch, he hesitated before leading his horse toward the barn. Abigail felt a pang of disappointment, but moments later, he emerged and walked toward the house. "Should you be outside?" he asked, climbing the steps to join her. "Dr. Sullivan said fresh air would do me good," she replied. "Besides, I was going stir-crazy indoors." Mason nodded, settling into the chair beside her. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening sky. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough," Abigail said finally. "I should return to town soon." Mason's head turned sharply toward her. "You're still recovering." "I'm much stronger now," she insisted. "And the new school term will begin in 2 weeks. There are preparations to be made." "Is it? Are you uncomfortable here?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. Abigail studied his profile in the fading light. "No, quite the opposite. Everyone has been wonderfully kind." "Everyone except me," Mason said, the words barely audible. "You've been distant," she acknowledged. "I thought perhaps you regretted offering your home." Mason ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as signaling his frustration. "I've been trying to give you space, to not take advantage." "Advantage?" Abigail echoed, confused. He turned to face her fully, his expression earnest in the twilight. "You nearly died protecting my nephew. You're recovering in my home. It didn't seem right to." "To what, Mason?" she prompted when he faltered. "To court you," he finished, the words rushing out. "Not when you might feel obligated or grateful, not when you're dependent on my hospitality." Abigail's heart skipped. "Is that what you want, to court me?" "I've wanted to since the day you arrived in Great Bend," Mason admitted, "but I never found the courage. Then when I saw you fall, when I thought I might lose you before I ever had the chance to tell you how I felt." He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. "Tell me now," Abigail said softly. Mason reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle as they enclosed hers. "I admire your spirit, your kindness, your determination, the way you've made a life here so far from everything familiar. The way you care for every child in your classroom as if they were your own." He paused. "I think I started falling in love with you the first time I saw you teaching Tommy about constellations." Your face lit up with the same wonder as his. Abigail's breath caught. "You never said anything." "What could I offer that would tempt a cultured Boston lady? A widower's ranch and a ready-made family." He shook his head. "But nearly losing you made me realize I'd rather risk rejection than regret." Impulsively, Abigail leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was a brief kiss, chaste but filled with promise. When she pulled back, Mason looked stunned. "I'm not so cultured that I can't recognize a good man when I see one," she said. "And I've seen how you care for Tommy, how you treat your workers, how you've built something meaningful here. I've been hoping you might see me as more than just your nephew's teacher." The smile that spread across Mason's face transformed him, erasing the worry lines that had become too familiar. "I see you, Abigail Vance. I see you clearly." From that evening forward, their courtship proceeded with a sweetness that belied its dramatic beginnings. As Abigail regained her strength, they took slow walks around the property, Mason showing her his favorite spots: the creek where he'd fished as a boy, the old oak where he'd built a fort with his brother, the hilltop with views stretching to the horizon. 2 weeks later, when Abigail returned to her position at the school, Mason began riding into town each evening to escort her home, first to her small room above the schoolhouse, and as their courtship deepened, increasingly often to his ranch for dinner with him and Tommy. The events surrounding her injury weren't forgotten. Frank Desmond and his gang faced trial when the circuit judge arrived, with Abigail testifying from her wheelchair, still too weak to stand for long periods. Mason sat beside her throughout the proceedings, his steady presence a comfort as she relived that terrible day. When the judge sentenced Desmond to hang for attempted murder, Mason showed no satisfaction, merely nodding grimly. Later, when Abigail asked if the sentence brought him peace, he considered his answer carefully. "Justice isn't about peace," he said finally. "It's about ensuring he never hurts another soul. My peace comes from elsewhere now." The way he looked at her left no doubt about his meaning. As summer turned to fall, their courtship deepened. Mason began joining Abigail at church services, enduring the knowing smiles of the townspeople with good humor. They attended harvest socials together, where Mason surprised her by being an accomplished dancer despite his initial protests. During the October cattle drive, when Mason was away for 3 weeks, he wrote to her daily simple, heartfelt letters describing the trail and confessing how much he missed her and Tommy. Abigail saved every one, reading them by lamplight after her school day ended. Upon his return, dusty and trail-worn but grinning at the sight of her waiting at the edge of town, he proposed. There was no grand gesture, just a quiet moment as they walked along the creek near his property, the autumn leaves creating a carpet of gold and crimson beneath their feet. "I never thought I'd find love again after losing my brother and his wife," Mason said, stopping to face her. "Raising Tommy seemed like challenge enough, but you changed everything, Abigail. You made me see possibilities I'd given up on." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "This was my mother's. I'd be honored if you'd wear it as my wife." The ring was a simple gold band with a modest diamond, but to Abigail it was perfect. She accepted with tears in her eyes and joy in her heart. They married in December, with snow dusting the ground outside the small church in Great Bend. Tommy stood proudly as his uncle's best man, beaming as Abigail officially became his aunt. The townspeople filled the pews, the same community that had rallied around Abigail during her recovery now celebrating her happiness. Their first months of marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery. Abigail continued teaching, though now she rode to town with Mason each morning before he attended to ranch business. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, sometimes helping with the bookkeeping or garden, other times simply providing a listening ear when Mason returned from a long day's work. In the evenings, they established new traditions, reading aloud to Tommy before bed, playing checkers by the fire, planning improvements to both the ranch and the school. Mason proved to be a thoughtful husband, attuned to her moods and respectful of her independence. Their physical relationship blossomed with the same steady warmth as their courtship. Mason was gentle and patient, and Abigail found herself falling even deeper in love with him as they explored this new dimension of their bond. Spring brought new beginnings. The scar on Abigail's shoulder had faded to a pale line, though it still ached sometimes before rainstorms. More significantly, she discovered she was expecting their first child, news that left Mason speechless with joy when she told him. Tommy was equally excited at the prospect of a cousin, peppering Abigail with questions about the baby and offering suggestions for names mostly drawn from his favorite adventure novels. As her pregnancy progressed, Abigail cut back on her teaching duties, training a young woman from Hayes City to take over in her absence. Mason hovered protectively, insisting on hiring additional help around the house despite Abigail's protests that she wasn't an invalid. "Humor me," he said, kissing her forehead. "I nearly lost you once. I'm not taking any chances with you or our child." Their son was born in late November, a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair like his father's and eyes that promised to be as blue as his mother's. They named him William Thomas Calloway William for Abigail's father, and Thomas in honor of the nephew who had inadvertently brought them together. The following years brought both challenges and blessings. The harsh winter of 1878 tested the ranch's resources, with Mason and his men working around the clock to keep the cattle alive through blizzards. A drought the subsequent summer threatened their crops until late August rains finally broke the dry spell. Through it all, their partnership deepened. Mason came to rely on Abigail's sharp mind and unwavering support, consulting her on ranch decisions and respecting her insights. Abigail, in turn, found in Mason the steadfast companion she'd always hoped for, a man who valued her independence while offering his strength when needed. Tommy grew into a thoughtful young man who excelled in school and showed a natural aptitude for ranching. He doted on his little cousin, teaching William to ride as soon as the boy could sit up straight. In 1880, their family expanded again with the birth of a daughter, Alina Grace. Mason proved to be as tender with his little girl as he was strong with his son, often carrying her on his shoulders during evening walks around the property. The incident that had brought them together was seldom discussed as the years passed, though neither forgot it. The scar on Abigail's shoulder remained a tangible reminder of how suddenly life could change for better or worse. On the 5th anniversary of the shooting, Mason found Abigail standing on the porch, gazing at the sunset with a pensive expression. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Heavy thoughts?" he asked. Abigail leaned back against his chest. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out. If I hadn't been near the school that day, if I hadn't seen Frank Desmond raise his gun. If you hadn't been the bravest woman in Kansas," Mason finished. "I still have nightmares about it, sometimes seeing you fall, the blood." "I would do it again," Abigail said firmly. "Not just for Tommy, but for any child." Mason tightened his embrace. "That's why I love you, but I thank God every day that you survived, that we found each other in the aftermath." "Some good came from the darkness," Abigail agreed, turning in his arms to face him. "Though I wish we could have found each other without the drama." Mason smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Would you have noticed me otherwise? The quiet rancher who barely strung 2 words together around you." "I noticed you from the beginning," Abigail admitted. Your kindness to Tommy, the way you listened when others just talked, the respect you showed me when many men dismissed a female teacher from back east. I wish I'd spoken up sooner, Mason said. We lost time. Abigail rose on tiptoes to kiss him. We have plenty now. As Great Bend grew with the railroad's expansion, so too did the Calloway Ranch prosper under their joint stewardship. Mason's innovative breeding practices improved their herd, while Abigail's management of their finances and suggestion to diversify into wheat provided stability when cattle prices fluctuated. Though she eventually passed her teaching position to others, Abigail maintained her passion for education. She established a small library at the ranch, open to workers' children and neighboring families. Later, she joined the school board, advocating for better resources and fair pay for teachers. In 1884, when William was 6 and Alina 4, Mason was approached to run for county commissioner. He initially refused, uncomfortable with politics, but Abigail encouraged him to reconsider. The county needs honest leadership, she argued. Someone who understands both ranching and business, who cares about families and schools. With her support, Mason campaigned and won, serving 2 terms with distinction. His fair-minded approach to disputes and practical solutions to county problems earned him respect even from political opponents. Tommy, now 17, took on greater responsibility at the ranch during Mason's absences for county business. He had grown into a thoughtful young man with his uncle's quiet strength and a scholarly inclination inherited perhaps from Abigail's influence. Have you thought about college? Abigail asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, Mason inside putting the younger children to bed. Tommy looked surprised. I always assumed I'd work the ranch. You could do both, Abigail suggested. Study agriculture or veterinary medicine, bring that knowledge back here. Your uncle would support whatever path you choose. Tommy considered this. I'd like that. To learn more, see a bit of the world, then come home. Home will always be here, Abigail assured him, squeezing his hand. Family doesn't diminish with distance. The following year, Tommy enrolled at Kansas State Agricultural College. His departure left a temporary void, but letters arrived regularly, full of excitement about his studies and new experiences. That same autumn brought another surprise. At 33, Abigail discovered she was expecting their 3rd child, news that both delighted and concerned Mason given her previous difficult delivery with Alina. Are you certain you're strong enough? He asked, worry creasing his brow as they lay in bed discussing the news. Abigail placed his hand over her still flat abdomen. Life brings no guarantees, Mason. We both know that better than most. But yes, I believe I'm strong enough. We're strong enough together. Their 2nd son arrived in the spring of 1886, a peaceful birth that belied their concerns. They named him Robert Mason, a healthy boy with a calm disposition who completed their family. As the children grew, the ranch expanded further. Mason's reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread throughout Kansas and into neighboring states. When the railroad established a new shipping point just 3 miles from their property, the Callaways' prosperity seemed assured. Yet wealth was never their primary measure of success. Instead, they took pride in their children's character, their workers' loyalty, and the improvements they brought to their community. Mason and Abigail established a scholarship for Great Bend students seeking higher education, remembering Tommy's opportunity and wishing to extend it to others. Tommy returned from college with new ideas for the ranch and eventually took over more of its management, allowing Mason to focus on his increasing civic responsibilities. William showed his father's affinity for horses, and Alina inherited her mother's love of books, while young Robert revealed a surprising talent for music after Abigail purchased a piano for the parlor. Time brought changes to Great Bend as it did everywhere. The wild frontier town of Abigail's arrival gradually transformed into a settled community with brick buildings replacing wooden structures, telephones connecting businesses, and automobiles eventually appearing alongside horses on the streets. Through it all, the love that had blossomed between Mason and Abigail remained constant, deepening with shared experiences, strengthened by overcoming challenges together, and expressed in countless small gestures of consideration and care. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Mason surprised Abigail with a trip to San Francisco, a city she had long wished to visit. As they stood on the deck of a ferry crossing the bay, watching the sun set over the Pacific, he wrapped an arm around her waist. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked, gesturing to the spectacular view. "When you first came west, or on that day when everything changed?" Abigail leaned against him, contemplating the question. "I imagined adventure, purpose, maybe even love if I was fortunate. But this you, our children, the life we've built, no, I couldn't have imagined anything so perfect in its imperfection." Mason chuckled. "Perfectly imperfect, that describes us well." "Would you change anything?" she asked. "If you could go back," Mason considered this seriously. "I would have asked you to dance at that first harvest social instead of watching from across the room. I would have told you how I felt sooner." He paused. "But the important part's finding you, loving you, building our family, those I wouldn't change for all the gold in California." Abigail turned to face him, taking in the familiar features now lined with 20 years of weather and laughter. His hair had threads of silver at the temples, and crow's feet marked the corners of his eyes, but she found him more handsome than ever, dignity and character etched into every line. "That terrible day," she said softly, "when Frank Desmond tried to shoot Tommy when you rode out for vengeance. I was so afraid I'd lose you before I ever truly had you." "I was a different man then," Mason acknowledged. "Anger drove me more than sense. Yet you showed mercy in the end." Mason nodded. "Because I knew, even then, that becoming a killer would make me unworthy of you." Abigail reached up to touch his face. "No, because your true nature asserted itself over your rage. You've always been a protector, not a destroyer." As they returned to Kansas, they found their grown children managing well in their absence. Tommy, now married with a child of his own, had handled ranch operations seamlessly. William, 17 and responsible beyond his years, had overseen the household with the help of 15-year-old Eleanor, while 13-year-old Robert had apparently charmed the entire household staff into indulging his every whim. The children were growing up, the world was changing, but the foundation Mason and Abigail had built remained solid. In 1906, as they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children, Tommy's family, and friends from throughout the county, Mason proposed a toast. "To second chances," he said, raising his glass to Abigail. "And to the woman brave enough to take a bullet, strong enough to heal, and loving enough to build a life with a tongue-tied cowboy who took far too long to speak his heart." Laughter and applause filled the room, but Abigail had eyes only for Mason. In that moment, she was transported back to their beginnings, to a dusty street, a moment of terror and the aftermath that had led them here. "To love that transforms," she responded, raising her own glass. "And to the man who taught me that true courage isn't found in grand gestures, but in daily devotion, unwavering integrity, and the quiet strength that holds a family together through every storm." As they stood together, surrounded by the life they'd built, Abigail felt the familiar twinge in her shoulder, the old wound that had brought them together. But now it served as a reminder not of what she had lost, but of all she had gained. A single moment of courage, a split-second decision to protect a child, had altered the course of many lives. What had begun in violence had transformed into decades of love. And as Mason's hand found hers across the table, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choice again. For the bullet that had wounded her body had ultimately healed her soul, bringing her to the place and the man she was always meant to find.